Chapter 35. "I can't do it," said Ferris. Holt's eyes darkened in anger as he looked at his brother. Ferris quailed before the look, shrinking back onto his throne as if the oversized wooden seat gave him strength. "I won't," he repeated petulantly. "I can't, and you can't force me to do it." "Don't be too sure of that," Holt told him. He glanced at Horace and Sean, saw the contempt on one face and the bitter disappointment on the other. But he knew Ferris was right. He couldn't force him to stand up to Tennyson. "Why should I, Holt? Why should I do what you say? What's in it for you, after all?" His eyes narrowed in suspicion as he said the words. In Ferris's world, people only did things out of self-interest. Now he wondered what Holt stood to gain if he, Ferris, denounced Tennyson as a charlatan. And as he had the thought, the obvious answer rose up before him. He slid off the throne and stepped forward to face Holt, emboldened now that he could see his brother's ulterior motive. "Suddenly, I see. You want me to stand against Tennyson in the hope that he and his followers will kill me. That's it, isn't it? You'll let them do your dirty work for you, and then you'll magically reappear and take my place on the throne. And I wager you'll simply accept Tennyson's conditions when you do." Holt studied his brother's face for a few seconds, saw the devious mind working behind the ever-shifting eyes. He shook his head in utter contempt. "I might think that way, Ferris, if I were you. But my real concern is for the people out there." He gestured in the direction of the town below them. "The ones who call you their king, who look to you for leadership and protection. And God help them, for they'll get little of either from you." "Please, Your Majesty," Sean said, stepping forward. "Please reconsider. Holt is right. The people do need you. They need someone to lead them, to take charge." Ferris laughed scornfully at his nephew. "Oh, it's please Your Majesty now, is it, Sean? Yesterday you were all too ready to call him Your Majesty, weren't you? Don't think I don't see through your treacherous ways. You're in it with them." Sean stepped back now, as if being too close to his uncle made him feel unclean. His voice was low and angry as he spoke. "I have never been disloyal to you, Your Majesty, never." The anger was so palpable that Ferris eyed his nephew nervously. Perhaps he had gone too far. He knew how much he relied on Sean, but he still refused to budge on the main question. "Perhaps I spoke too hastily," he said in a conciliatory tone. Then his voice hardened and he turned to Holt. "But I will not do as you ask. If you want to oppose Tennyson, you take the risk. You go out and rally the people behind this ridiculous sunrise warrior of yours." "If it comes to it, I will," Holt told him. "But I'm a stranger here, and you're the king. It will seem—" Before he could continue, Ferris seized on his words and interrupted. "That's right. I am the king. I'm glad someone here remembers that small fact. I am the king, and I will decide for myself." He drew himself up, trying to look haughty and decisive. But the eyes, as ever, gave him away, as they constantly shifted and slid away from any contact with the other three. Holt silently cursed Ferris. He had hoped to browbeat him into defying Tennyson. But the king's abject and cowardly refusal meant his plan was in ruins. Without the king's authority, any resistance to the outsiders would be ineffectual. The people would not follow an unknown stranger and a young warrior against Tennyson, the saviour of Mount Shannon and half a dozen other villages, a skilled orator and an expert at whipping a crowd into a frenzy, and a man with hundreds of fanatical followers at his back. In spite of his inner turmoil, Holt allowed no sign to show on his face. He drew breath for one last attempt to convince Ferris. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, for it had all been said already. He stopped when he heard a commotion outside the throne room doors. Then one of the doors opened and a guard entered, hurrying towards the small group at the far end of the room. Holt noticed that he reported to Sean, not Ferris. That might be simply protocol, or it might indicate where the man's real loyalty lay. "Sir Sean, there's a messenger outside. Claims it's urgent. He wants to see this one." He indicated Holt. Sean turned to him. "Are you expecting a messenger?" Holt hesitated. It could only be one person. He addressed the guard. "Is he dressed like me?" he said, indicating the mottled cloak and empty double scabbard, as before they had left their weapons outside. The guard nodded. "He is indeed. Exactly so, Your Honour." "Yes," Holt told Sean. "I was expecting him. He has important news bearing on this problem." He had no idea why Will had come after them, but he reasoned that it must be important. Sean nodded to the guard. "Let him in." The guard withdrew, and a few seconds later, Will entered the room. Ferris let out a snort as he took in the cowled cloak, the drab brown and green tunic and leggings. "Huh! Brought your own follower, have you, Holt?" he sneered. "I'd say that Tennyson has a few more than you." Will glanced curiously at the king, seeing the same similarities and dissimilarities that Horace had noted the day before. Then he dismissed him and looked to Holt. "He's here," he said simply. For a moment, the significance didn't register with Horace, but Holt saw it immediately. "Tennyson?" he said, and Will nodded. "They're setting up their camp. He's announced that he'll be addressing the people at 3 o'clock. There was a 12-hour water clock in the throne room, and Holt looked quickly at it. It was just before 1 o'clock. Inwardly, he was seething, but, as before, he controlled his emotions so there was no trace of them on his face or in his manner. "Very well," he said. "Thanks, Will. Go and keep an eye on them. Let me know if anything else develops." Will nodded. He glanced inquisitively at Ferris, then back at Holt, his eyes asking a question. "How is it going here?" But Holt's quick headshake told him not to ask it aloud. Will gathered all was not well. "Right, Holt. I'll be at the market ground. That's where they're setting up the pavilion." He turned and left the room quickly. Holt studied his brother's set features, and he felt a very unfamiliar sensation, that of failure. But he had to try once more. "Ferris," he began. Ferris raised an eyebrow. "That's Your Majesty, I think." He sensed that Holt was going to try appealing to his better nature, perhaps even to plead with him. And now, as he knew he had the upper hand, his confidence flowed back. Holt glared, but before he could say anything, the young warrior who had accompanied him cut him off. "Your Majesty," Horace said, and his tone was conciliatory, even respectful. "I think I might see a way to resolve this problem, and it's one that we might all profit from, if you take my meaning." He rubbed finger and thumb together in the universal gesture of greed, a gesture that Ferris understood only too well. The king turned to him, interested to hear what he might say. But Holt interrupted before Horace could go further. "Leave it, Horace. It's useless," he said, his voice tired. Horace pushed his bottom lip out, assumed a thoughtful expression, and replied, in a slightly disparaging tone, "Oh, Holt, let's skip your claptrap about honour and duty to the people. You've tried, you've failed. Face up to it and move on. Now I can see a definite opportunity with this Sunrise Warrior nonsense. Why shouldn't we make a little cash for ourselves here?" He looked back to the king. "And a lot for you, your majesty." Ferrus nodded. Horace was talking the language he understood best: self-interest. Holt's angry reply convinced him. "Horace, shut up! You've forgotten your place. You've got no right to—" "Oh, come off it, Holt. Admit for once that your way isn't going to work," Horace told him, cutting him off. Holt stopped, but the fury was still evident on his face as he glared at his young companion. "He's speechless," Ferrus thought delightedly. Then Horace turned to the king again. "Well, your majesty, interested?" Ferrus smiled and nodded. It wasn't just the promise of money that attracted him. It was seeing his brother bested, and seeing his impotent rage when one of his followers turned against him. "Go on," he said. He barely heard Holt's bitter exclamation as his brother turned away. He could see the disappointment in Sean's face at Horace's unexpected interruption. Serve him right. Sean was an idealist, and it was time he learned a little about the realities of life. Horace looked around the big, echoing throne room, saw a small curtained doorway to one side. "Perhaps if I could have a few words in private, your majesty, could we—" He indicated the side room. "My robing room," Ferrus said, and led the way towards it. "We can talk in there, undisturbed." He looked meaningfully at Sean and Holt as he said the last word. Horace followed him, shouldering his way past Sean as he did so, a smirk on his face. Sean shook his head and turned despairingly to Holt. The ranger had his eyes lowered, but as the king and Horace went through the curtain, he looked up to meet Sean's gaze. The young Hibernian was startled to see that Holt was grinning. He went to speak, but Holt held up a hand. A second or so later, they heard the sound of a fist striking against flesh and a sudden cry of pain, cut off by the clatter of furniture being knocked over. Then Horace's voice came from behind the curtain. "Can you come in here, Holt?" Sean followed as the ranger crossed the room and stepped behind the curtain. The chamber was a small annex where the king's official robes for state occasions were kept. It contained a large wardrobe for the purpose, along with several chairs, a dressing table, and a mirror. There was a small fireplace in the corner. The king was stretched unconscious on the floor, an overturned chair beside him. Horace was shaking his right hand, nursing his obviously bruised knuckles. "Horace Altman," Holt said, "what on earth have you done?" Horace gestured to the wardrobe full of official garments. "I've just elected you king," he said. "Start getting dressed."